Well, good morning again and welcome to Face the Nation and our annual CBS News Correspondent Roundtable. Joining me here in the studio, Chief White House Correspondent Norah O'Donnell, Political Director John Dickerson, Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes, National Security Correspondent David Martin, and Justice and Homeland Security Correspondent Bob Orr. In New York, our Senior Business Correspondent Anthony Mason, and in London, Correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you because one of the most dramatic moments on Face the Nation this year was when Egypt suddenly erupted. Everything was in turmoil there, and when we switched to you, here's what happened.
There's reason to believe that the looters are ununiformed police who've kept their weapons and turned into thugs. And in fact, it may be a way.
You were not dive bombed, as it turned out, Elizabeth. They were just flying over for show. But how is it these days in Egypt? We know what happened that day. Where are we today in that part of the world?
Well, shortly after that incident, Mubarak was forced to step down. And since then, Egypt has been lurching very uncertainly toward electing a government. But the problem is the military doesn't really want to let go of power. So we've had round after round of violence and chaos, really. And the big winners so far are the Islamists, the political party representing the Muslim religion, look set to form the next government. So it's highly unstable.
Bob Orr, the biggest story of the year, in my view, was the killing of Osama bin Laden. How's the war on terror these days?
Well, that was a game changer when it comes to core al-Qaeda, Bob. The network put together by bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri over a decade ago was preeminent in planning attacks against the West. Getting bin Laden was crucial if this country was going to bring down al-Qaeda. And I think now we can say, we can start to envision the death throes of the core part of that network. That's all good news. Core al-Qaeda is probably not capable of a 9/11 style attack anymore. But the bad news is this ideology has kind of flattened out and moved across a number of continents. So we have hotspots in Yemen, hotspots in Somalia and North Africa. So the threat goes on, it's just a little different.
And David Martin, another big story. The last U.S. military troops left Iraq. There's still a large American presence there, but the last military troops are out. Where are we on that?
Well, the day after combat troops left, the Prime Minister Maliki issued an arrest warrant for his vice president on grounds that the vice president was actually running death squads. Now, we have political crises in this country. We call it Democrats versus Republicans. There, it's Shiites versus Sunni. We don't settle our political disputes by guns. In Iraq, they do. And so the question is whether this crisis will dissolve into sectarian fighting that the Iraqi army and police can't control, in which case all the sacrifices of the past 9 years are put at risk.
What you're saying is that this whole thing might fall in?
It could. The presence of the U.S. military was a big tamping device on top of all that seething sectarian discontent and hatred.
In this country, of course, Nancy and John Dickerson, it was all about the Congress and what the Congress didn't do. I laughed one day and said, you know, it's a good thing Congress hasn't done anything this year, because if they had, we wouldn't have any place to put it with all the news that we had otherwise. But it was quite a year up there on the Hill, wasn't it?
It was, and I think what we learned this year is that divided government, which in the past has produced some really remarkable pieces of legislation, doesn't produce the same kind of results when you have two parties that are so far apart the way that these two are right now. And, you know, the modus operandi on the Hill for so many years has been to leave legislation to the last minute, funding the government, this payroll tax cut. It's worked in the past, but it doesn't work anymore because you have a new crop of Tea Party House Republicans who have no interest in political expediency. That's not what they ran on. They're not just going to get along. When they don't like a piece of legislation, they don't mind if it makes them look bad in the short term. They're going to stand their ground.
And Anthony Mason in New York, perhaps the news that many of us found the kind of the most discouraging. I don't know what word to put on it, but for the first time in a long time, U.S. securities were not the safest place to put your money. Our financial securities were downgraded. This whole thing about the economy kept on. Unemployment stayed high. What was the biggest thing that happened this year, you think?
Well, I think I would call it an embarrassment, Bob. That's what it was. I mean, our debt rating was downgraded, and it looked like, that would cost us money because our interest rates would go up. But as it turns out, the rest of the world was in worse shape than we were. So, in fact, people were still investing money in the United States and still buying our debt. That didn't solve the jobs problem, though. That continues to be the biggest lingering problem out of the financial crisis and the recession. We just aren't producing enough jobs, and even though the economy is kind of stumbling along, it doesn't look like it's getting a whole lot better.
Norah O'Donnell over at the White House. The president seemed to catch it from all sides. The Republicans obviously don't like him. But a lot of people on the left were very disappointed in the president and said he didn't fight hard enough for the things that they thought he ought to be fighting for. His approval ratings are certainly nothing to brag about. What's he going to do in the next year?
Well, no doubt it has been a very tough year for President Obama domestically. As you pointed out, his approval ratings have been below 50% for almost the entire year, with the exception of the killing of Osama bin Laden, where the president saw a spike in his approval ratings. Jobs are still the #1 issue for the president. And as you see, he tried to put forward, change the debate of that disastrous summer and the debt ceiling debacle to talk about the American Jobs Act. And guess what? Only one small piece of that bill has been passed, and that was, of course, to help veterans. So this has been a difficult year for the president domestically, but on foreign policy, they believe it was a successful year. Not only the killing of Osama bin Laden, they claimed some credit, of course, for successfully ending the war in Iraq, while there are still some sectarian tensions that exist. And they think that they've taken the fight to al-Qaeda in a way that President George W. Bush has done, and that will be a strength in the new election. But I think this is going to be, next year is going to be a year when the president tries to pivot and try and rack up some successes on the economy, or else he won't be reelected.
John Dickerson, you have the hardest job of all as our political director to try to make some sense of the politics of all of this and what's going on. I have to say, this is one of the most unusual, for want of a better word, campaigns that I've seen going into Iowa here now. I mean, up and down. Somebody said Bob Orr was now leading.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He's got a very good ground game. That picture Norah paints of the president in peril. Republicans see this golden opportunity right before them, and they're so desperate to grab it. And yet, what has happened in this primary season, both nationally in the polls and in Iowa, we've seen a sort of king for a day. You had Michelle Bachmann doing well, then Rick Perry doing well. Herman Cain had his moment. Newt Gingrich had his moment in Iowa. And going into the caucus, he's undergoing a blistering amount of attacks, and he doesn't have the organization or the money to fight back, in part because his campaign was declared dead in June. So what's happening now going into the Iowa caucus is it's all up for grabs again. In a race where it's been up for grabs, well, it goes in that way. And Mitt Romney, who has kind of stayed steady and at about 20% in the polls, well, that's where he is, where he is too. And just finally, Ron Paul has supporters who love him. His supporters are not undecided like the rest of Republican voters, and he is the one who's now having his little moment in the sun.
Let me ask you this. Let's suppose that somebody does eventually get the Republican nomination. Somebody will. That puts that person against Barack Obama. How does that campaign, how does the general election start out? About even? Will Obama be favored? Where do you see it right now?
Key thing to look at is those 12 swing states. We forget the rest of the country, just focus on the 12. Where it stands there is in most of those, it's about even. Some polls you can show either the president or one of the Republican frontrunners is ahead. But what we suddenly get very quickly into is a debate over a referendum on the president's behavior, the economy, almost exclusively, unless we have some foreign event that interrupts. And then the president will try and stop that conversation and say, no, this is a conversation about the attributes, qualities, and vision of whoever it may be, Mitt Romney or Newt Gingrich. And it is not going to be a pretty election at all. No more hope and change and glowing speeches. It's going to be a pretty ugly campaign.